Every holiday season, my parents turn gift giving into a tool for shaming me, and this year, I decided to give them the ultimate gift in front of everyone. I'm a 29-year-old man, and for as long as I can remember, Christmas has never been about family or joy. It has always felt like a performance, a power play orchestrated by my parents. Each year, they transformed the act of giving into a spectacle, a carefully staged event where they donned the roles of the generous, doting parents for my younger sister and brother. Christmas morning was a parade of extravagant presents, new gadgets, designer clothes, and the latest gaming consoles. I still remember the year my brother received a brand new car. Meanwhile, my gifts were consistently humiliating: a pack of generic socks, a thrift store sweater that was 2 sizes too big, and self-help books about finding direction in life. When I turned 17, they gifted me a weight loss guide for teenage boys, despite the fact that I wasn't even overweight. I can still picture myself sitting there, clutching that book while my siblings unwrapped the latest iPhones, my parents beaming at me, waiting for a thank you. The room was filled with relatives who awkwardly laughed, looked away, or pretended not to notice the blatant favoritism. If I dared to show even a hint of disappointment, they had a rehearsed response ready. "You should be grateful for what you get," they would announce to the room. "Some kids don't get anything at all." Every year, the same script played out. If I smiled and played along, I was finally maturing. If I looked upset, I was spoiled and selfish. It didn't matter what I did, they always won. My other parent never intervened, sitting there sipping coffee and later telling me not to take it personally. The moment I turned 18, I began plotting my escape. I took on extra shifts at work, saved every penny, and moved out as soon as I could afford a small apartment. I stopped going home for Christmas, citing work or travel plans. It took a few years, but eventually, I carved out a life for myself, a career, a place of my own, and a sense of peace. Then came the guilt trips. "You're ruining the family," my parents would say over the phone. "Your siblings miss you. Do you really want to break us apart like this?" It took a while, but they wore me down. I convinced myself that maybe, after all these years, things had changed. Maybe they had changed. I agreed to come home for Christmas that year, and it was a mistake. The decorations were the same as always: twinkling lights, a towering tree, and a table stacked with expensive gifts. My parents greeted me with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The gift exchange began, and my sister received a designer purse while my brother unwrapped a top-of-the-line laptop. When it was my turn, my parents handed me a single envelope, grinning widely. I opened it to find a printed list of life tips for late bloomers. Certain lines were highlighted, offering advice on better money management and taking responsibility for my future. I stared at the paper, then looked up. My parents were watching, waiting. I didn't react. I smiled, tucked the paper back into the envelope, and thanked them. They looked almost disappointed, as if they wanted me to crack, to lash out, to create a scene so they could deliver their favorite line. But I had already started planning my revenge. Over the years, I had worked my way up the corporate ladder, made smart investments, stayed out of debt, and built a financial stability my parents had never managed. They spent money recklessly: lavish vacations, designer clothes, expensive furniture, always flaunting a wealth they didn't possess. They had constructed an image of success, but I began to notice cracks in the foundation. A few months ago, while catching up with an old family friend in finance, I learned something shocking. My parents' names had come up in a list of pre-foreclosure notices. I checked for myself, and there it was: their house was about to be taken by the bank. The same house where they had humiliated me every year, where they had held their power over me for so long. It didn't take long to confirm everything. My parents had always been bad with money, but this time, their reckless spending had caught up with them, and the bank wasn't offering them a way out. The moment I saw that notice, I made a decision. I met with a lawyer, navigated the legal channels, and positioned myself perfectly. By the time the foreclosure was official, I was ready. I placed a winning bid at the auction. The house was mine. This year, Christmas would be different. My parents had always used gifts as weapons. Manicured fingers flipped through the pages slowly, their expressions shifting from pleased to confused. Then they stopped, their mouths twitching, fingers clenching, and the color drained from their faces. The room, which had been filled with laughter and chatter just moments before, fell silent. I leaned back in my chair, speaking clearly so everyone could hear. Since the house is going into foreclosure, I stepped in and bought it before the bank could sell it to a stranger. So now, I own it. A sharp intake of breath echoed in the room. My other parent froze, while my brother and sister exchanged glances, looking as if they had just walked into a horror movie. My aunt, who had been sipping her wine, let out a laugh before quickly covering her mouth. My parents' hands shook as they flipped through the papers again, their eyes darting over the legal documents as if hoping to find a loophole or a mistake that would undo what they were reading. But there was nothing, it was real. Then the screaming began. They shot up from their chairs, gripping the papers so tightly that they crumpled in their hands. Words poured out of them, fast and furious accusations, insults, outrage. How dare you do this to us? You think you're so smart, don't you? Buying our home? You're trying to humiliate us in front of our family. It wasn't just anger, it was full-blown hysteria. They slammed the papers onto the table, their chests heaving. Some of the younger cousins watching from across the room looked scared. My brother clenched his jaw but remained silent, while my sister, still clutching her new designer bag, sat frozen, as if afraid of being dragged into the chaos. My parents turned, searching for someone to back them up. They locked eyes with my other parent, waiting for them to step in and defend them. But for the first time in my life, my other parent actually spoke up against them. I told you this was going to happen, they muttered. You never listen. The rage on my parents' faces flickered for just a moment, replaced by something closer to panic. They turned back to me, their voices shaking. You can't just do this. You can't just take our home away from us. I didn't react. I reached for my glass of water, took a sip, and set it back down before I spoke. I didn't take it, I said, keeping my voice calm. You lost it. A few people in the room looked away, pretending to check their phones, while others watched closely, barely blinking. My parents' hands balled into fists. You wanted this, they hissed. You waited for this moment. I didn't argue. The meltdown escalated quickly. My parents grabbed the stack of papers and threw them across the room, the pages scattering over the floor, sliding under chairs and across the carpet. They were shaking, their entire bodies vibrating with rage. What do you expect us to do? I didn't flinch. I expect you to either start paying rent or find another place to live. Silence. For the first time, my brother spoke, his voice tight. So what happens now? I leaned back, unfazed. That's up to them. My parents' breathing was ragged. Then, as if trying to regain control, they straightened up and smoothed out their clothes, looking at me with eyes burning. We will never pay rent to you, they declared, as if saying it out loud made it true. But it didn't matter, because in my hands, I held all the power now, and whether they liked it or not, things were about to change. The moment my parents threw the foreclosure papers across the room, Christmas was officially over. The stunned silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. A few relatives tried to salvage the evening, awkwardly refilling drinks or forcing conversations, but it was useless, the energy had shifted. My parents stormed upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind them so hard that one of the ornaments on the Christmas tree rattled off and hit the floor. My brother shot me a murderous look, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, while my sister sat frozen, gripping the handles of her new designer bag like it was a life preserver. My other parents sighed and rubbed their temples. The room cleared out fast after that. Some relatives exchanged quick goodbyes, clearly not wanting to get involved. A few looked at me with something close to respect, as if they had just witnessed a long overdue reckoning unfold. My aunt gave me a small nod before slipping out the door, her smirk barely concealed. As I gathered my things to leave, my brother followed me into the hallway, cutting me off before I could make it to the front. Deserved it. Then came the calls from my parents, but they didn't reach out to me directly. Instead, they called my workplace one morning. My boss pulled me aside, managing to keep a straight face as he relayed the voicemail they had left. They had ranted about my unstable behavior, warned him that I was manipulative and dangerous, and tried to convince him to reconsider my employment. My boss deleted the message before even finishing it, telling me it sounded like a bitter, desperate attempt at revenge. It didn't stop there. My parents tried to act as if nothing had happened. They remained in the house, going about their lives as if it wasn't legally mine. They didn't acknowledge the foreclosure or the Christmas disaster, they carried on as if I had simply made up the entire situation. My sister began distancing herself, torn between the mess unfolding in front of her and the reality she had been trying to ignore. My brother, on the other hand, took the opposite route. He dug his heels in, furious at me and fully believing my parents' version of events, that I had blindsided them, betrayed them, and torn the family apart out of spite. It became clear that my parents had no intention of taking responsibility, no intention of moving out, and no intention of acknowledging what had happened. So, I gave them a legal reminder. The first eviction notice was delivered a few weeks later. The paperwork was airtight, they had no legal claim to the house, no lease, no standing. But they still refused to acknowledge it. That's when they tried one last desperate move. A relative reached out, claiming my parents wanted to make peace over lunch. The whole thing was staged, obviously an attempt to guilt-trip me into backing down. I declined. That same night, I received a long, rambling voicemail. The tone shifted wildly. At first, they were sobbing, begging me to fix this. Then they were furious, blaming me for ruining the family. By the end, they were demanding that I undo everything, as if I could magically reverse the foreclosure, as if they hadn't ignored every warning sign. I deleted the voicemail without responding. I made my boundaries clear: if they wanted to talk, they could do it through an attorney. They never reached out again. It was clear now that this wasn't going to end quietly, my parents weren't going down without a fight. The eviction notice arrived, but my parents acted as if it didn't exist. They went into full-blown denial mode, telling anyone who would listen that it was all a misunderstanding. They spun the story their way, claiming I was confused and bluffing to make a point. According to them, there was no way I'd actually follow through. They told my siblings that I had some kind of vendetta, that I was trying to punish them for being strict parents. My brother ate up every word. The calls started first, then the texts. At first, they were disguised as concern, asking if I had really thought this through. That didn't last long. The messages quickly turned into full-blown rants about how I was destroying the family and making our parents homeless over a stupid grudge. I ignored them. Then the messages got nastier. He called me selfish, cruel, a heartless traitor who was ruining Christmas for everyone. He sent long, angry paragraphs one after another, sometimes in the middle of the night. I blocked him. My sister, on the other hand, took a different approach. She wasn't angry, just hesitant. She admitted that our parents had been unfair for years but pleaded with me to find another way. She wanted me to be the bigger person, to stop things before they got worse. I didn't argue with her, I just reminded her that our parents had already ignored every warning, and this was the result. My sister went quiet after that, not picking a side but slowly pulling away from the situation. My parents didn't stop there. When they realized they weren't getting through to me, they turned to my other parent. They demanded that they fix this, but for once, they didn't take their side. They refused to get involved, telling them they had brought this on themselves. That threw my parents off completely. They had always expected my other parent to back them up, to play peacemaker. So, they tried something else. A few days later, I received a letter from a lawyer. Except calling them a lawyer was generous, it was a family friend of theirs who probably Googled eviction law 10 minutes before drafting the letter. The wording was weak, full of vague threats and dramatic language about a son's duty and emotional distress. I sent it straight to my lawyer. He laughed and reassured me that they had no case, no lease, no legal claim, nothing. If they wanted to fight this, they'd be wasting money they didn't have. That must have been the moment reality finally set in, because that night, their own son. The story changed depending on who they were talking to. To some, they were helpless victims, abandoned after years of sacrifice. To others, I was a heartless villain who had swooped in to steal the house out from under them. They conveniently left out the part where they had ignored every warning, every overdue bill, and every chance to fix their situation before it reached this point. Then they tried to go after my job again. One morning, my boss pulled me aside, barely containing his amusement. Someone had sent an anonymous email filled with accusations about my unstable behavior and troubling history. It was a mess of lies, clearly an attempt to get me fired. My boss read it aloud, shaking his head before deleting it on the spot. We both knew exactly who sent it. But my brother took things even further. Since I had blocked him on everything, he found another way to lash out. One evening, as I was leaving work, he was waiting in the parking lot, standing near my car with his arms crossed and jaw clenched. I didn't stop, I walked past him as if he wasn't even there. That's when he exploded. He started shouting, demanding that I fix this. People turned to look, and security stepped in immediately. When he refused to calm down, they escorted him off the property. HR was notified, and they assured me that any further incidents would be handled. That was the last time I saw him. Security called the cops to issue a formal warning, and that was the final straw for me. I blocked him on every possible platform, no calls, no texts, nothing. After that, my sister reached out. She apologized for our brother's behavior but still tried to convince me to be the bigger person. I let her talk, but I didn't waver. Then came my parents' next move. They suddenly decided they wanted to talk, but instead of reaching out directly, they used our aunt as a messenger. They acted like they were finally ready to make peace, pretending that they just wanted a simple conversation. I didn't fall for it. But then things took a turn. A friend of mine who lives nearby called me one evening with a warning. They had overheard my parents ranting to a neighbor, saying that if they had to leave, they were going to destroy the house first. I didn't take the threat lightly. I hired a property inspector to document everything, every wall, every fixture, every appliance. I wanted a full record of the house's condition in case they followed through. My lawyer reassured me that if they caused any damage, they could be sued and possibly arrested. The final eviction deadline was approaching fast. I expected them to make a scene, to fight, to drag it out, but no one expected what they did next. On the last day before they had to leave, my parents made their most unhinged move yet. The eviction deadline was less than 48 hours away when I got home from work that evening and immediately noticed something was off. The lock on my apartment door wasn't broken, but it felt different. I stepped inside, and that's when I saw it. My drawers had been rifled through, my cabinets left slightly ajar, and a few things were missing. I checked my valuables first, my laptop, jewelry, and anything expensive were still there. But when I went into my closet, my stomach dropped. A box that had been buried in the back, full of old family heirlooms and childhood photos, was gone. So were my spare house keys. I checked my security cam footage. Sure enough, there they were, my parents. They must have still had an old copy of my apartment key from years ago. They had let themselves in while I was at work, taken what they wanted, and left. I called the police immediately and reported the break-in and theft. When they arrived, they took my statement, checked the security footage, and confirmed that my parents had unlawfully entered my apartment. Because they still had an old key, it was considered unauthorized entry rather than a forced break-in, but the stolen items made it a criminal matter. The officers contacted them directly, warning that if they didn't return the stolen property immediately, I could press formal charges for theft. Instead of denying it, they went on a tirade, insisting that the items were rightfully theirs. The police told me they could move forward with an arrest if I wished to pursue it, but I opted to give them a final chance to return the items before escalating further. The next morning, a package showed up at my apartment. Half of my stolen belongings were inside, but the rest were still missing. I followed up with the police, and this time they didn't give them another warning. The report was officially processed, and they now had a criminal case on their record. I didn't wait around to see if they would escalate further.